This is part 2 of a 2-part series in the face of fire. Last week, we heard from a group of locals who kind of convened to DIY as a cohort in a very strategic, safe, intentional, informed way. And this week, we're hearing from Austin VanScoy, who's a certified arborist with the International Society of Arboriculture. I don't know if I said that right, but former wildland firefighter and owner of Dutchman Tree Service here in Ely. And before this program, we were chatting and I asked, how long have you lived in Ely? And it's only been 3 years. Austin moved here and started a business and brought his family into this community. And we're so grateful that you did that. And we're so glad that you're here. Welcome, Austin.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me in the back? Yeah. Well, I'm going to apologize in advance for my raspy voice. What a day to lose my voice. So, yes, this is part 2 of our 2-part series, In the Face of Fire. And we are, so again, Austin VanScoy. I am one of several forestry contractors that serve this region north of Duluth. I'd like to welcome my fellow contractors who have joined us here today. If you would please raise your hands if you're present. There's a lot of us. There's 20, 30 of us north of Duluth here that all are here to help you guys mitigate the risk of fire on your property. So I just wanted to thank the people that did show up here today, that were contractors. I also want to thank the wildland firefighters that showed up today. So let's get started. Our focus during this 2-part series in the face of fire is to look at different ways from an arborist perspective to accomplish fuels reduction on your properties, not only to protect you and your structures in the event of a wildfire, but to also promote the health and biodiversity and resiliency from biological and environmental effects long-term on your property. Last week, the One More Tree group presented a hands-on with hands tools workshop with a do-it-yourself approach. They have manually removed tons of fuel from their forests and property by cutting and burning it. They were clear to let us know that their way is just one more way to get the job done. Today, what I will be doing is sharing other tactics with you that have shown to have very positive and sustainable fire and ecological effects in your forest. So a lot of my experience in this industry includes the use of hand tools, and now more often I'm using equipment to perform fuels reduction. As you can see here, there's just some of our stuff today, in second. So my objectives are to mitigate the risk of wildfire spread, with safety being the #1 priority on your property. And then 2 is to ensure that the forest remains resilient, both in the short and long term. As seen, the best land stewardship practices recognize that both fire safety and forest health are essential. It's important to complete the initial fuels reduction work with the least amount of damage to the soil, healthy standing trees, and of course, structures. I will reiterate that it's very important. There needs to be a delicate balance of machinery and the footprint you leave when going the mechanical route. The soil is critical to promote tree health. The canopy trees condition is critical to promote adequate regeneration, as well as provide habitat for wildlife. It's a balance to be sustainable. It's a balance to be a sustainable and biodiverse forest. Simply put, when the fuels reduction work has been done carefully, treated areas will be able to grow in a sustainable, resilient forest. The point I'm trying to make is that in the event of a spreading wildfire into our wildland urban interface, if you guys don't know that term, it's on a handout terms. The available resources have to evaluate every property. If there's been no fire mitigation performed around the things worth protecting, The resources will likely not invest their time in making it more defensible in the heat of the moment, you know, during a wildfire. Uh, in other words, as a former wildland firefighter that used to do structure protection, if a structure had an abundance of fuel surrounding the structure and their neighbor's place did not, we would allocate our time towards defending the neighbors. Due to the higher likelihood of our last minute ditch efforts would be the most effective. Uh, so that's why we're talking about this. Sorry, guys. So let's get into fire behavior. Fires can start and develop from something as small as a spark from a dragging trailer chain or a bump, a burning cigarette butt. Also, things like down power lines or lightning strikes can easily start a wildfire. It doesn't take much under certain weather conditions and soil conditions as well. The main thing I'd like you all to grasp about this intro to fire behavior is the amount of fuel loading that's present in our forests, mostly in our wildland-urban interface. Historically, when we had reoccurring natural wildfires prior to development and fire suppression, there was less understory in our forests. That equated in less intense wildfires. Low intensity fires were a necessity to maintain healthy forests back then, and our indigenous people and Mother Nature did a pretty good job making sure our landscape had fire. Frequently. That process was fantastic, not only for the forest, but the wildlife and biodiversity of the forest. Did you know that the process of burning actually prevents unwanted balsam fir understory from regenerating? So, an example on the contrary is, have you ever seen an area that was blown down or logged off? The balsam fir just exploded with, natural regen in the following years, as well as the site is, on the contrary, you look at a site that was prescribed burn and then revisiting it, you see a lot less balsam fir present. And then you see a variety of natural species or native species regenerating, right? So all that's building up into a brief discussion about present day fire behavior. With the amount, size, and poor health that our understory is in right now, this is leading to very intense wildfires, as we've seen with the Greenwood Lake fire. What occurs is the understory, that's going to be this stuff right here, right? Live and dead balsam primarily will carry fire across the landscape, right? As that fire builds up heat under the canopy trees, it's actually preheating them. When the understory is as tall as it is now, it serves as a ladder to the crown of the canopy trees. Since they have been preheated, they can catch fire and create a crown fire. Those are bad, right? As most of our northern Minnesota trees are fire resistant, they're not fireproof. When that foliage gets torched, the tree produces a massive push of heat, right? And that compounds the preheating effect, makes it worse. And with the wind and topography, crown fires can spread abundantly and are very difficult to suppress. They're absolutely devastating. An example, if anybody's ever driven down Highway 2 in the last year or so, you can see the effects of a crown fire, right? So I think I've kind of beat a dead horse here with fire behavior. This is a fire mitigated forest. You get these low intensity burns, which are really good for the ecosystem. They're really, really good for the forest. And then you get these ladder fuels. And because we haven't had the fire suppression, or we haven't had the forest management, I'll put it, these ladder fuels have just gotten just incredibly tall, and it's preheating the crowns of our canopy trees and then creating this crazy fire behavior, right? So I took this photo from the treetop. This is an example of really tall understory trees. They aren't supposed to be this tall, right? They're just poking up through the crown, and here's like a well-established red pine, almost 85 feet tall. You know, these ladder fields are very thick. This is right down Highway 1 here. This is what our forest looks like. There's not much biodiversity there. There's dead balsam, and then there's some standing aspen. Not much foliage on the ground for the wildlife to forage on. Not much at all. I mean, this is the shape that our forest is in right now overall. I'm sorry if I'm being a Debbie Downer. I don't want to be Debbie Downer. I mean, yeah. This is the fun part. So I hope you guys grab this handout here, the pros and cons of the 5 different methods of fuels mitigation. So we're going to get into them right away. I'm going to try and go through this rather quickly because you guys have handouts here. So let's talk about slashing. So slashing is essentially just like cutting the understory down, cutting it into small pieces or breaking it up with machinery and spreading it out across the forest floor. Right. Some pros to slashing is you're turning the ladder fuel, the thing that carries the fire, into a ground fuel. Okay. So you're going to have a little less intense fire behavior. It prevents soil compaction and or damage from burning. It provides habitat for small animals, rodents, things like that. Eventually that material, as it's broken down on the forest floor, creates nutrients for the soil, which then in turn helps the canopy trees. Yeah, and then if you use machinery to do slashing, right? Like this is a logging machine. When a logging machine drives across the slashing, it breaks it up into small pieces and compounds that, speeds it up. And then of course that material helps disperse the weight of the equipment, so you're doing less soil damage when you slash, right? Some of the cons is you're not reducing the fuel load in the forest. Fuel load is another term on that sheet. Fuel load, you're not reducing it because the fuel is there. You're just changing the characteristic from a ladder fuel to a ground fuel, or so there's still a risk of spreading wildfire with the right fire conditions, topography, wind, that sort of thing. And then it's aesthetically maybe not as beautiful as some other methods. And then, when you cut all this material down, whether it's live or dead, if it is alive, you're killing it, and that dead material will attract pests and insects, right? So you want to keep that in mind if you're going to be performing slashing on your property. If you have really big pine trees or anything like that, it's important to try and get it broken down, decomposed as quickly as possible, because insects like to feed on like freshly dead or dying things. So you don't want to attract more insects in your forest that are going to kill your overstory trees or stress them out. Let's get into hauling. Oh, there's another example. Sorry. There's another example of slashing, right? It just kind of, you just cut the stuff up, spread it out. This is hauling, right? So you're cutting the understory, you're hauling the material out of the forest into a pickup or a trailer, whatever you got, and you're hauling it to a disposal site, okay? You can also like hire out one of these people. We have a few resources available in the Ely area with a log truck like this. It's called a clam truck, and you can stage material, hire this resource. They can come out and they can haul it all in one scoop, right? Most of these trucks are between 50 yards and 65 yards of brush. That's a lot of brush. So they can do a lot in a very short amount of time. And, the goal is to, you're actually removing the fuel from the forest. You're not changing the characteristic. You cut the understory down, you drag it out, you haul it away. So it reduces the, potential spread of wildfire onto your property, not having the fuel there. It makes the forest look pretty darn clean. It increases wildlife access and usability, right? They can get through the woods better. This is kind of an interesting thing. When you remove the understory out of the forest, what will occur is you get more sunlight and rain to the north, to the forest floor. You actually get a breeze too. And what will happen is you'll get you'll get more understory, like ground foliage, like largely faster bunchberry, all the little forest plants, native forest plants we have, and the animals like to forage on those. So when you create any opening in the forest, you're going to see wildlife start to creep in and forage and things like that. Kind of the con to opening up your forest and not having as much soil as you could have is you get wind throw. So you get a big windstorm or even just a steady wind, and you just took all what would have been soil out of the forest, and now your trees can tip over, right? So you want to be really cautious of that, how much understory you remove at a time. It's best to do it in phases if you can. It's pretty labor intensive. I would be concerned with your specific site as well. If you have a very tight access, limited space, and you're staging material for a clam truck, I'd maybe talk to your clam truck driver and make sure you can get in and out of there, and maybe not pile it underneath power lines and things like that. Make their job harder. uh, I'm guilty of it, right? Awesome. I think we covered hauling. So pile burning, something we've done a ton of, and I'm sure most of you have done a ton of. It's really, really fun. Basically, you're cutting the trees down, you're limbing them up, you're stacking the limbs like an umbrella, and you want to make the piles as skinny and as tall as possible so that wind can push through the pile and dry the pile out. Because I'm sure there's a lot of people that have tried to burn a pile in the winter and it doesn't burn, right? Tall and skinny, and when you burn, I'm going to try not to go in a rabbit hole here. You're reducing the fuel load just like you would if you're hauling the material, you're burning the material. Once it's been burned, it's not burnable. About 5% of that piece of wood is left over in ash. And the ash don't burn, it's black. So it's really, really important to, when you're burning, to keep that in mind. You also want to make sure that, sorry, I'm just going to review here. You also want to make sure that when you're burning, you're taking notes of where you're burning, and you're also keeping in mind, like, okay, what are my canopy trees doing? Is there critical root zone? Usually a critical root zone of a well-established tree is at the tips of the branches. If you were to hang a plumb bob, if you're going to be burning a lot of fuel in a critical root zone, you really want to be careful with how hot that pile burns, because you don't want to burn up the soil or the roots under that tree, which would increase wind throw and eventually starve the tree nutrients down the road. So it's important when you're piling to just make sure that you're keeping the piles as small as you can, and burning them nice and cool, and also trying to get as much consumption as possible. It can be, you can make the piles with machinery. I wouldn't recommend it because it's really, really hard to burn them. And generally the piles are huge, so they burn really hot. But here's an example of like what a typical pile burn would look like. And then of course you want to keep in mind all your, your burning bans and regulations. We burned here at nighttime because it was just fire behavior was high and we had to get the piles burned. So pull a permit, make sure you're following the rules, and have a contingency plan if things get out of hand. This is kind of what to expect if the piles aren't built really tall and skinny, as well as I didn't really burn these at a great time of the year. It was like 20 below. This is way out on an island on Burnside, and there was 2 feet of snow on these piles. So everything, all these butts are frozen in. I'm a pretty strong guy, right? And I could not get these pulled out because they were frozen. Same with just the moisture in the pile from all that snow. We try and scoop the snow off, but you're just not going to get 75% or more consumption. You might get more like 25 to 45% consumption. So keep that in mind when you're burning. Let's move on to, this is cool. I took these photos this month at a site that we did some pretty big pile burnings. This pile was made with machinery, and it was relatively big. It was probably like 10, 12 feet wide, 10, 12 feet tall. It was a big pile. And you can see all these little tiny sprouts. Those are aspen, right? Aspen regen. And they're so thick. and they're about 3 years old. We burned 3 years ago. So this is kind of what to expect when you create a pile and it burns pretty hot. You'll get a lot of that aspen regen. Same with green logs. This pile was mainly made with live trees, and they were relatively big bulls. The trunks were large, so not good consumption when you're burning the logs at all if they're green. This was a pile that was like huge, like 20 by 30 maybe, because the fuel load was just insane. And all that came back was raspberries. And the reason why is because the soil got toasted and it sterilized the soil. And raspberries and sometimes invasive species are the only thing that can really regrow in those really, really low nutrient soil bases, right? So let's talk about mulching, and we'll get into chipping last. Mulching can be done with either like a designated mulching machine, or it can be like a skid loader with a mulching attachment, or an excavator with a mulching attachment, right? We see this oftentimes along the roadsides. If you drive down Highway 1 right now, you see the mulching on either side. You know, basically when they're using an excavator, they're shredding the tree, they're reaching up as tall as they can, and they're zipping the top off the tree, and they're shredding the whole thing in one go as quickly as they can, right? And the spray just kind of goes wherever. With a skid loader or a designated forestry mulcher machine, there's actually a little push bar on it. So they start at the base of the tree and kind of grind down at the stump till the tree is weak enough to push over, and then they drive over it a bunch of times till they actually are able to grind all the material up. And up here on the range, we have really rocky soil, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. I've wrecked about 2 of these machines already trying to do this. It is not easy up here. So if you're going to be mulching, keep that in mind. It really, the more you drive over it, the more you grind it down, the finer the chips get and the better it looks. Okay. If you have really, really rocky soil, what I say is it's a coarse mulch. It's big pieces and it's little pieces and everything in between. It's just what you get. So it's ideal for like you know, tightly packed stands of balsam fir. You know, everyone's probably seen an isolated pocket where it's so thick you can't walk through it, right? There's almost no biodiversity in there, just all balsam, maybe the occasional canopy tree. And the mulcher is nice for pockets like that because you're not grinding up any regen because there's none. It's just all balsam. So, you know, you can get in there and you know, be pretty productive and not worry about grinding up like sapling trees that are already trying to get established, right? Plus the roadsides, really efficient for roadsides. You can get a giant excavator with a mulcher and clear a ton of land very quickly and create like a shaded fuel break. So we'll get into kind of the soil, what that looks like when you mulch this. It's a lot less labor intensive than some of the other manual ways to do it. You know, you're sitting in a machine. So again, you're not reducing the fuel load, you're changing the characteristic of the ladder fuel to a wood chip. So anybody in here, by a show of hands, tried to burn wood chips? It's kind of difficult. Yeah, they're wet. They absorb moisture, they hold moisture, right? So when you mulch the roadsides, like down Highway 1, or you mulch you mulch your forest, you're creating chips. And those chips are not only beneficial to preventing the spread of wildfire, but they're also super beneficial for the existing trees that you're leaving, right? Because they hold moisture. There's a lot of things that the trees benefit from that. Excuse me. Another thing too, that when you're taking the material and you're grinding it into a wood chip, remember how I mentioned when you're slashing, it attracts bugs and insects? Yeah, they're not interested in wood chips. They just pass. And if you're chipping something that has bugs or insects in it already, it will grind them up as well. You don't really have to worry about that at all, which is a really, really cool thing about chipping and mulching. Some of the cons of mulching, it's not as aesthetically pleasing, especially up here on the range. You know, you got all the rocks. You can't really grind it up into a fine coarse or a fine mulch. It's more coarse, right? It's difficult to walk through. if you've ever mulched on a large scale, like if you were to try and take a hike on the side of Highway 1 right now, you'd be having a hard time. So wildlife kind of feel the same way. You know, they're going to take the path of least resistance typically. You know, sometimes it's difficult to work in like peat areas, swampy areas, wet areas, because you're using machinery. And the limited broadcasting capabilities of the chips can be kind of a challenge when you're mulching. It can be really difficult to direct the chips into an area where you want them, and that's important. I'll get into that. So here's an example. This is right on the intersection of 135 southbound, where you could take a left to go to Aurora or a right to go to, is it Bewabic, I think. This is right there. They mulched this forest, a good swath of it. I think it's like 60 feet or so. And you can see what it looks like. This is what we did. It's kind of a mixture of really fine mulch and coarse mulch. And we just did the roadsides for an easement job for a township. And this is like a forestry mulching job. So you can see, like, if there was any little sapling trees, they're gone. It's really, really hard to protect. So keep that in mind if you're going to mulch your forest. You might want to focus on replanting. It'll take a while. Let's get into, yeah, so there's another zoomed in picture. So the wood fragments can be a variety of different sizes. And then again, just another example. It's really opens things up. And the mulch, so I'll kind of talk about that now. The mulch, I'd mentioned how it holds moisture, right? And fire doesn't like moisture. So it definitely helps create like a shaded fuel break. The perks to these overstory trees, like this is a really, really nice tree. This is a nice tree. Those are all nice trees in there. That mulch is going to insulate the soil both in the summer when it's extremely hot and in the winter when it's extremely cold. And we get a rainy season like this in the springtime, that mulch retains the water for a really long time. And that extends the root growing period of these existing canopy trees, and they get better rooted. So you get less wind throw and you get less like stressed out trees from insects and pests, right? And that's kind of the benefit of spreading the mulch in your forest, right? Excuse me. Yes. So really, really, really cold temperatures can damage roots as well. Yes. No, the root growing season is generally the beginning of spring, like May till about June. So when you have a nice moist soil that's well insulated, it extends that season. So oh, no. So let's talk about chipping. So chipping, you can definitely tell this is a much different forest product. This is we define this as compostable wood chips. So this stuff is like gold. You can put it in your flower beds, you can put it, pretty much anywhere, and it's going to be very beneficial. You produce this with one of these two machines. This chipper has tracks and it's remote controlled. So it drives through the forest. You can drive it right up to a tree that you felled and pick it up and feed it in, right? This chipper has wheels and it's designed to be towed with like a truck or something like that. And it's really convenient for like roadsides and anywhere where you can pretty much pull it up to where you're working. You can just feed this stuff right into the chipper. And both of these chippers have chutes on them which direct the chip spray. So you can adjust these. Like this one, I believe, doesn't go all the way around, but some of them will go 360 degrees. And you can direct the spray of the chips because the goal is to get a 2 to 4 inch thick layer evenly throughout the forest floor. You don't really want a thick layer of chips. You don't want too thin a layer of chips. There's a sweet spot in there. So these two machines are really, really handy for producing this compostable mulch. I'll get into the case study once I go over the pros and cons. So generally, this application is best suited around like structures and roadways. I say that because it's a relatively larger investment. you're using more specialized equipment, it's harder to get, and as well as it takes a lot more time. And you're essentially doing this, you're spreading the mulch out in your forest for a few different reasons. One is to produce healthy canopy trees, but to also protect the little seedlings that you don't want to damage when you're chipping. And with the mulcher, it's difficult to do. So the chipper, you're felling the trees at the base, you're strategically felling them so that, oh, there's a sapling there, I'm going to fell it over there. And then you can, bring it out to the chipper, chip it, and then you can broadcast those chips and try and get them in that kind of key layer. And so this is an example. This was a case study down Highway 1. It was one of our first projects we did as Dutchman Tree Service. This lady was so kind. She let us do mulching, chipping, and pile burning. So she was kind of like our trial client. It was 5 acres, and we focused on chipping in like right around the house. We really didn't want to go too crazy with it, and then we did the pile burning way out in the woods. And this is what it looked like before, right? Really tall ladder fuels, dead and dying forest. This is all damage from the budworm primarily, and her forest consisted of jack pine, white pine, red pine, aspen, and then her understory was essentially balsam fir, and there was some hazel in there too. Not a whole lot of seedlings at all. It was just so dense and so thick. So this picture was taken from the same exact spot. I'm actually forward a little bit, but it definitely opens the forest up when you eliminate the understory out of the stand, right? So this project we did in April or November of 2021. I came and revisited it in July of 2022. And there's a common misconception about mulch that it suppresses everything. It really doesn't. This just a few months after we did it, this is what the forest floor looked like. So it just explodes with vegetation, and that vegetation is really key to improving your wildlife and also your biodiversity. And all of this was chipped. So this is all those small compostable wood chips. And going into April of this year, this is taken from that same spot. So 3 years later, it's still relatively open. Almost no balsam firs come back. The canopy trees are looking a little bit better. They're a little more lush, a little more green, and almost no blowdown at all. So that was really cool to see. Here's an example of the regen that tends to come back. So this is a 2-year-old white pine. These are little 1-year-old white pines, and they all sprout. So we did the treatment 3 years ago. 2 years ago, this came up through the mulch, and 1 year ago, these came up through the mulch. So that's really cool. It's really nice to see that forest naturally regenerating. So this is obviously in the mulch again. So this was a 2-inch thick layer of mulch applied 3 years ago, and I pulled it back, and about an inch underneath that, 2 to whatever inch layer is just beautiful black dirt, and that is a 2-year-old sapling. These are little 1-year-old saplings, and same thing. They're doing really well. This is regen in the spots where we did pile burning. So not all those piles were made with machines. We did quite a few of them by hand, and we burned them, kind of cooler, quickly. And it actually rained on us when we were burning, so not all of them burned that great. But you can definitely tell that, the similar effects. These are like this, I think, was 2 years. This was a couple years, and this one was 3 years. So you definitely, the mulch will suppress the regen for like a year, and then you'll start to see new growth come back, versus when you burn, it's almost instant. Pretty interesting. So I breezed through the 5 different methods. There's so much to know, so much to learn. And if there's any questions, we'll take questions at the end about that. I'm very happy to answer all of your questions. Another point that I want to make too is, like, no matter what method you perform on your property to mitigate the risk of fire spread potential, it's always a good idea. Something I would really encourage you guys to think about in your stewardship plan is to try and reintroduce fire back into the forest at some point. It doesn't have to be right away. We're kind of in a drier year, so it's no pressure. The pressure is just to get the material out of the forest so we don't burn down. But at some point, when things start to come back, when your saplings start to get, about yay big, when your forest is starting to look healthy again, put fire down. Get fire in the forest however you can. You can do little 1-inch strips if that's, or 1 foot, burn strips if that's all you can do. And but it's really important to try and reintroduce fire back in your forest. And you can burn the mulched areas, several years down the road as well. That, you got plenty of leaf litter that falls, plenty of needle cast that falls, and all that will accumulate pretty thick, and that stuff will burn just beautifully. And by then, that mulch should have decomposed to black dirt. So you're good to go. Where are we at here? Oh, identifying your goals. Look at that. So Thea's group last week, the One More Tree group, offered a list of questions to consider when you're deciding what to do with your property. We're going to review what they said and then take it a little bit further. So, the questions they asked were like, what do I want for my property and my safety? What would be needed to accomplish this? What resources do I have available? What do I want to do the work myself? Do I want to do it with a group or hire a contractor or a combination of these things? These are all very important questions. As you develop goals for your land, I think it's important to begin with the end in mind first, right? It's really hard to think that way when you're looking at a stand of trees. Do your absolute best to think about the end in mind before you begin. Excuse me. So what do I do now to encourage that to happen? Well, in my experience working with landowners, here are some questions that we tend to ask and help them decide on the best approach to ensure fire safety and forest health in the long term. I asked this question this morning on a sales call and she came back at me and said, why does this matter? Is your property year round or seasonal? This is good to consider in the event that you're not around, having the peace of mind that your property is protected. Also, it will help you understand how much time and resources you can allocate towards fire safety and land stewardship. I think we can all, nod our heads and say, yeah, it takes a long time to do this. So if you're only up here for a couple weeks out of the year, a couple months out of the year, that's something to consider. That's why we ask that question. What are the things you value most from your property, right? Do you value the trees? Do you value the wildlife, lake views? Do you value your neighbors? Right? Peaceful and secluded, privacy, old trees, biodiversity, low maintenance, less hands-on, more hands-on. Do you like doing forest chores? Do you like running chainsaws? Are you into foraging or hunting? Being able to come up on a hair's whim and enjoy your property and all the community has to offer. We like to make a list of these things so that you can see your priorities and what you value most from your property. It's really important. If you could wave a magic wand, how do you want your forest to look in 5, 10, 20 years? That really helps us get the picture that you have painted in your mind. And this goes with any contractor. If you were to just come out and say, hey, if I could wave a magic wand, I want it to look this way. That really helps us figure this out. Who or what else is reliant on you to take action towards improving your forest and making it fire safe? Any forest friends, neighbors, community members? In your opinion, what do you believe that your property could, do you believe that your property could withstand a wildfire currently? Excuse me. If the answer is no, then what is most urgent and important that you need to do to decrease your fire risk? Sometimes if people don't know, they just, you know, I'll run them through like the landowners like risk assessment form. I think Gloria's got a handout back there on the table. It's a form, a checklist you can go through, and you can just focus on the things on your house that you can do. It's not all about the forest necessarily, but you know, really try to, you know, there's tools out there that you can employ to really help answer that question. What's most urgent and important about mitigating the risk of fire on your property? Oh, this is another great question. If you hire things out, what is your deadline and when the work needs to be done? Right? That's a good one to establish with a contractor or with yourself. If you're going to be doing the work, it's nice to set that goal so that you can schedule out your, you know, your project and make sure you're staying on track. Is there something you think you can do in the meantime to make a difference? Maybe even lower the cost of a particular service. These are all questions that we will recommend you start with. If you write down the answers, it's nice to be able to revert back to these questions and make sure that whatever you're doing stays in alignment with your values and goals, starting with what's most urgent and important. So, oh yeah, here's all the questions. Sorry, guys. So in summary, in closing, I hope that all of you can take something from both part 1 and part 2 of this series, In the Face of Fire. My goal in this week's presentation was to talk about fuels mitigation and some of the long-term ecological consequences of forest health. Also dig deeper in the mechanical world and explore the pros and cons of these treatments. Hopefully I cleared up a lot of mystery and that those unexplored treatment options have to offer. Additionally, the landowners in the room should have a good anchor point to start planning out their forest stewardship property. With all that being said, thank you all for having me, as well as the One More Tree group. Thank you, Thea, for helping put this all together, and Macy as well. And thank you for being here. Can I take your questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Can I bring you the mic?
I was wondering what your definition of skinny is with a pile.
Oh,
Because I think of a pile in terms of diameter.
yeah, you want it as narrow. Think of it like a cylinder.
Yeah.
Yeah, you want it as tall and skinny as possible without it tipping over.
I just say that because I've had some very big piles that were pretty scary, and I learned to kind of think in terms of diameter of base. And keeping it about 4 feet, you can't go that high.
Yep.
Which limits the blaze, and I think that's really helpful. I'm thinking from a landowner's do-it-yourself perspective.
Yeah.
But
That's an awesome perspective. Yeah, that's fantastic. 4 foot wide, 4 foot tall, whatever you can do. Yes. What's your question?
As a good balsam.
The question was, is there such a thing as a good balsam? No comment. Yes.
Proud of. Absolutely. Which things do you go back and lop off other than the balsam? Are there some things that you shouldn't let come back up? Or how dense do you let your aspen? Or when it regrows, what do you do?
That's a fantastic question. So the question was, after you do the balsam thinning, what are you targeting to remove afterwards, to keep it firewise? So balsam for alive or dead is flammable. Trust me. So that's the big one. You just want to make sure that your balsam, it's almost like weeding your garden. You know, every couple of years, go out there and just yank the little balsam out, and that's going to be the least labor intensive thing you can do to keep up on your forest stewardship plan. Other than to really answer your question, I'd have to have a clear understanding of what your goals are. You know, if you want the most natural forest as possible, let everything come back other than balsam. Cause Mother Nature or indigenous people, when they burned, balsam didn't come back because fire prevents the germination of balsam fir, right? So I really don't think that the present day balsam fir density that we have was the way it was 200 years ago. I think we have a lot more than what we had. So if you just want a very, very natural forest, if you really like your privacy, if you want the forest to be thick, you're not so much, you know, worried about the wildlife necessarily. Yeah, let it all grow back. The main thing too is if you have a desired species that you want to grow back, like white pine and red pine, right? I love white pine and red pine. When you do your forest, your initial firewise, we'll call it, and you remove all the balsam, something you could do to encourage those little white pines and red pines, cedars, things like that to come up is to take a lopper or a weed whacker or something and remove all those competition trees, right? Cut them all down. You can just slash them because they're small and little, and that will create more sunlight to that tree. It'll decrease its competition for nutrients in the soil. It does a lot of things. So if you really want to encourage your whites and reds and cedars to really start to take off in the following years after your treatment, that's a really good idea to go back, a year or two after and just weed your garden, right?
I've got a question over here.
Yeah, what's your question?
Is how high or low should stems be? I have a bunch of stems and they're very. I was wondering what's the best way to cut them.
That's a great question. If you're using your forest for picnicking, and you're going to be walking through it a lot, you probably want the stumps as low as possible at the ground. But on the contrary, if they're up a little bit higher, you can see them, right? So you can walk around them. So I don't think it's necessary to cut the stumps as low as possible to prevent fire spread. So it's, yeah, the stumps can be high and a wildfire is not going to behave much differently.
And about what is the cost for a shipper? Like have a shipper come in?
I would say it depends. It really depends on your stand density.
I was afraid.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's generally a little bit more in cost.
We'll loop back because she's got more questions, but for the sake of fairness, we'll share the mic.
Do you have a source for, bringing in trees for your property? Area.
Yeah, the question was, is there a source to regen your forest? Excuse me. Basically, we don't have that service. There's programs like for the DNR, you could go to the DNR office and talk to them and ask them if there's any way to get trees. Sometimes they can send you a big box of trees. Sometimes they can send you a bag of trees. And otherwise there's nurseries, there's things like that. You can definitely source your trees. What do you got, Cass? Do you have something on that?
Well, if you do a DNR cost share program, they have a budget for specifically replanting trees. So you'll be able to order through them or the soil and water conservation. And those typical times are in March, February, March is when you order them. And the cost varies depending on the year. But if you order them early and if you have that cost share program, it becomes really affordable to do.
Cool. Awesome.
Thank you.
And you don't need a stewardship plan for a.
Perfect. Thank you, Cass. So you can also transplant too. Yep. If you have trees in other parts of your property, move them where you want them.
See? Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry. We'll get to you.
You mentioned about insects and pests and that they could be in down things. Can you give some perspective on the kind of effect that those insects, and I'm not going to call them pests because not all of them probably are, would have in the helping of decomposition of things that are on the ground?
It's an excellent question. I'll answer to the best of my ability. So when we see dead material scattered throughout the forest floor and it's got insects and pests in it, generally it dries out a lot faster than if it didn't. So when the material gets dry, it doesn't decompose like it would if it was wet. So I would say, I guess it's kind of site specific. How wet the forest stays is kind of, that's what affects the decomposition more than the bugs.
We've got some follow-up information here on seedlings and such.
If you're looking to source seedlings, small amounts, a good place to look would be the Soil and Water District. They do bundles of 25 trees, I think 25 to 35. You can kind of mix and match species. North St. Louis County does an annual tree sale. I'm sure maybe Lake County does too, that might be closer. But you can look at your local Soil and Water District website. Bare root seedlings from our state nursery, Bedora, the minimum order is 500. And so that's kind of a lot of trees. Another option is Itasca Greenhouse in Cohasset. They do native seedlings. They're all containerized. It's a good local source. Lots of different species. Have really, really good luck with those. And if you're gonna do large amounts for containerized, PRT out of Canada is where we get a lot of our seedlings. And like Hess said, DNR can cost share those. If you are getting a decent amount, I like landowners to get at least 100 or 200 to make it worth my while to do the cost share paperwork. But we can also help with bud capping, tree tubes, and the follow-up. So you can meet some of these goals that Austin's talking about. Kind of pushing your forest towards a more fire adapted type. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Austin, someone had the good idea just to see if you'd be willing to run through what services the tree service provides. What's on the menu?
Yeah, so we do, excuse me, we're a full house tree service. We do ornamental pruning all the way to fuels mitigation. So hazard tree removal, storm cleanup, tree risk assessments, planting, pruning, those sorts of things. Yeah, so it's pretty much the rundown. We had a question over here. Oh, I'm sorry. Question here?
There you go. Oh, sorry.
Okay, one of the questions I have is, I've been reading the birch that have come down on the ground. Because I figure this is a forest. But is that unwise as far as being fire wise?
Oh, I think it's wonderful. Those birch trees soak up water super fast. They decompose super fast. That's categorized as more of a heavy fuel type. So like grass and balsam, dead, things like that burn really flashy and quickly, right? Logs, especially when they're wet, don't burn that well. So you can leave logs throughout your forest floor. It's really, really good for like trees to seed. Sometimes they'll land on that log, and if that log is decomposing and has a higher nutrient rich base than the soil, that little regen tree that lands on that log has a better chance of taking off and thriving. So it's not always a good thing to clean everything off the forest floor. And it's nice to leave a log or two because you never know the off chance, right?
Yeah, and the mushrooms.
Yeah, and the
One
mushrooms.
last question here.
Question about balsams. If you take down a lot of balsams and then have them chipped, is that a bad source of chip mulch? Because they're balsams and more plentiful?
Great question. The question was, if you were to do the chipping and you chip all the balsams, is that less desirable chip source? Absolutely not. We chip whenever we do a forest thinning like this, a stand improvement or firewise thing, we're only going after the balsam. That's it. So everything, all those balsam trees get put through the chipper, and if they're green, they're gonna, I forgot my samples. If they're green, they're gonna decompose a lot faster than if they're dead balsams, but ultimately they're retaining moisture for the soil, they're insulating, they're doing all those wonderful things. And they really just don't burn. Yeah.
Wow,
Are we
I
out of time?
learned so much. We're out of time. Austin said he would stick around for a couple minutes to answer questions. There are still the handouts in the foyer. And we will convene again to learn next week from Ely's Loon Ranger, all about loons. And if you remember Sherry, she's an extremely enthusiastic presenter. You're gonna wanna be here. But one last round of applause for Austin and